years. I lived near Cloudcroft, New Mexico, in a little community called High Rolls. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of High Rolls, New Mexico. It's the flat spot between Cloudcroft and Alamogordo if you're going down the mountain. And but I'm a native Texan. I've only lived outside the state for 2 years. I don't know if you know much about Texans. You know you're from Texas if you're not about to go somewhere, you're fixing to go somewhere. You know you're from Texas if you run your air conditioner and your heater in your car on the same day, right? You know you're from Texas if you know what cattywampus and whoppy-jaw mean. They're synonyms for the very same thing. You know you're from Texas if you know what the 4 seasons are in Texas. They're dove, deer, football, and summer. Those are the 4 seasons we have. And you're a hardcore native Texan if you know what vainas are. Is there anybody here who doesn't know what vainas are? Raise your hand if you don't know. Oh, lots of people who don't know what vainas are. Well, vainas come in this little can, and some people call them Vienna sausages, but when I was growing up, we called them vainas. And my dad would take me fishing, and we'd have vainas and crackers and cheese to go fishing. So I'm going to come out here real quick, and I'm going to give away this can of vainas. Here, you look like you could use a can of vainas. The best part's when you pull off the top and it's got the gel right there. Just right there where you can do it. And you know, when you look at life, you can look at it like it's a Vienna, or you can look at it like it's vainas. And it's just a matter of how you look at it. It's about perspective. And what I'm going to be talking to you today is about how to find the light when darkness falls. And it's all about our perspective. It's looking at life in a different way. So, are the people here at Los Alamos, are you open-minded people? Are you willing to think about life in a different way? Of course you are. And so I'm going to tell you how you can look at darkness and find the light that's in the midst of the darkness. But first I have to tell you about my story. Because my story isn't just about the education I have or my work in hospice for 20 years, but my story begins in 1952 when I was 2 years old. In case you're trying to figure it out, that makes me 64. I know, I look so young to be 64. It just doesn't look that old. But darkness fell in my life at a very early age when I was 2 years old. Polio was an epidemic in Dallas. I know many of you here are probably familiar with the polio epidemics of the 40s and the early 50s. And my parents took me to the doctors, discovered I had polio. My brother was 7 at the time, not showing any symptoms of having polio. But they went and had him checked out. And as it turned out, he too had polio. We were both quarantined in the polio ward with the other children. My brother walked into the polio ward that afternoon, and by that evening he was in an iron lung, and 3 months later my brother died. And it was absolutely devastating for my parents. Absolutely devastating. You can imagine, they have one son who's died, and the other son who's in quarantine with the other children in the polio ward. My mother had a very difficult time with my brother's death. She had 3 mental breakdowns from the time I was 2 till the time I was 7. She did not handle her grief in a very healthy way. In fact, the folks who were helping my parents through the grieving process told them that the best thing for them to do would try to live as if my brother hadn't existed, to not have any pictures of him, and to not talk about it. And this was the prevailing theory in the early 1950s on how to deal with grief issues. And if you think about it, they're trying to say if you don't think about it, then you don't feel it, so just try not to think about it. And of course, it was an impossible thing for our family to do. And so it was like the elephant in the room in our family. I knew I had a brother. I knew he died from polio. I knew it had dramatically affected our family, but we didn't ever talk about it. And as a result of the way that my mother was handling my brother's grief, she ended up having electric shock treatments to help her deal with her grief. They gave her electric shock treatments to get her to not remember. And then when the electric shock treatments didn't work, they gave her insulin shock treatments. And so I look at my mother and how she was handled regarding her grief in the early 50s and look at it as if she were abused. My mother was never able to process my brother's death into her life. My father became very bitter. My father was bitter because you can imagine he's had a son that died, another son who's in the polio ward. His wife is having all these issues. And all of a sudden, my father's family disappeared. And so my father grew up very bitter and very angry when I was growing up as a child. And then I had my issues. I had braces on my legs. Sometimes I'd have to be in a wheelchair. Part of the therapy they did for me for polio was to put a cast on one leg to stretch the muscles, and then it'd be on for 6 weeks, and then they'd put a cast on the other leg to stretch the muscles, and I would have a therapist that came out to the house 3 times a week and give me therapy, which as a child, to me it was like torture, having your legs stretched out. Leg cramps at night, so painful I would wake up in the middle of the night crying out loud. Oftentimes wondering, why has God allowed this to happen to me? Fortunately, when I was 10 years old, I had 2 major operations that dramatically changed my life. My life was different from that time on. And so no one would ever know I had polio unless I shared with them I had polio. And so what I decided to do, because I was growing up in a house where we didn't talk about my brother's death, what I decided to do was that I was just going to leave that life behind. I wasn't going to talk about my polio years. I wasn't going to talk about my brother. And as I went into my junior high and teenage years, if friends asked me if I had any brothers or sisters, I would say, no, I don't have any. I'm an only child. I didn't acknowledge my brother at all. And so I grew up in high school, playing in rock and roll bands. When I go places, I tell people I'm an expert on rock and roll. So I'm a rock and roll chaplain, is what I am. And so I grew up playing in rock and roll bands, went to college, met my wife in college at Dallas Baptist College. And we got married, and then in 1972, when I was 22 years old, I had a major spiritual awakening in my life. And I had this major spiritual awakening in my life, and I just began to see all of life different. The darkness began to go away. I began to see light come into my life. I was going to be a lawyer, and then I just felt led by God to become a minister. And, I was sharing this with a group of people one time, and they began to applaud. And I said, well, why are you applauding? And they said, one less lawyer in the world. It was so good that God is so good. He just took somebody out and put them in the ministry. And so I was going to be a lawyer. I was working as a court clerk for the city of Dallas, headed on the path to be a lawyer. And when God changed directions in my life. And then I pastored several churches, pastored church in New Mexico, pastored church in Dallas. Then when I was 38, my mom died from emphysema, very slow dying process. It was just very painful, very slow. It was sort of like relief and sadness whenever she passed away. I was standing next to her bedside whenever she died, and a tear trickled down her cheek. And I thought it was very symbolic of her life. And so then 2 years later, my dad died suddenly of a heart attack. One day he was there, the next day he was gone. And I was 40 years old, and I went through a tremendous time of grief. That's when darkness fell. Darkness fell. I'm 40 years old. I'm in the ministry. I have a master's degree. I've helped people. I've given people advice. And here I am, after the death of my parents, not knowing what to do. It seemed like my life was cratering in. So I decided I'd go to a doctor and get a checkup because my dad had just died from a heart attack. I thought maybe there was something wrong with me. And so when I went to the doctor, he gave me a physical exam, did lab work. And he came and he talked to me and he said, I just want you to know there's nothing wrong with you physically. I think what's happening is you're grieving. I had no clue that I might be grieving. I didn't know that a part of grieving was going to bed at 10 o'clock at night and waking up at 2 o'clock in the morning wide awake. Feeling totally fatigued all the time. For being forgetful, walk into a room and not remember why you went into that room. Losing your car keys. I lost concentration. It was hard for me to concentrate. I was reading about 2 books a week until when my parents died, and then after that I couldn't concentrate to read any book. Slowly began to be able to read again by reading easy reading. I began reading, I'm going to make a confession to you all, I began reading Danielle Steele books to help me get through it. To help me get my concentration back. And it was a very slow process. And I went through about a year or 2 where it was very difficult for me to go through the grieving process of reorganizing my life. And then in the midst of that, I began to search for grief support groups. And this was in the early 90s in Dallas, Texas, large city. You'd think there'd be grief support groups, but I couldn't find any grief support group. And back then, if you wanted to find something, you had to look in the yellow pages or the telephone book. Now, now you can find things a little easier. But I couldn't find anything. So I began to search out support groups. I went to Alcoholics Anonymous, Overeaters Anonymous, Codependents Anonymous. If it had Anonymous in the name, I went to the group to see how they did support groups because I thought I would start a grief support group in my church. And I did. I started a grief support group in my church and it went well. I saw an ad in the paper for the Visiting Nurse Association. They were wanting a hospice bereavement coordinator. I had no clue what the word bereavement coordinator meant. Someone who's coordinating bereavement. Just seemed like an odd thing to me. So I called them up. I went and did the interview. Because I had started grief support groups and because I could speak in front of groups and I'd done some writing, they had me become their first full-time bereavement coordinator. And I have literally helped thousands of people go through the grieving process. I have spoken at events all across the country, and I have been helping people who have gone into the darkness through the grieving process and helped them find light. One of the secret things that people don't know about hospice services is that hospices provide 13 months of bereavement support after somebody dies. They provide support groups. They provide one-on-one counseling. They give you literature. It's one of the things that people don't know that's available to them. And it's a part of the Medicare benefit for hospice. And so I have begun helping people find light when darkness falls. And one of the things that I know makes grief so difficult is we don't have any information in our brain on how to handle grief. You can only do what you know to do. And we don't get any training in grief. How many of you, when you're in elementary school, your teacher talked about grieving one day? In middle school? In high school? How many of you went all the way through college but never had a course on grief? And you know what? 100% of the human race is going to experience grief. I was speaking at Southwest Medical Center, speaking to a group of students who are studying to be doctors, and I asked the professor, how much training will these doctors get in the grieving process? And their professor said they're going to get the hour and a half they have with you today, is what they're going to get. And I turned to these young residents, and I looked them in the eye, and I spoke to them, and I said, 100% of your patients are going to die, and they're all going to have family and friends who are going to need help. And so we don't have the information. We live in a world that's death-denying, grief-denying. We live in a world that doesn't want to talk about it. And so I'm going to help you see that if you're going through a difficult time through the grieving process, or if you know somebody who is, it's perfectly normal that you would be having a difficult time. You should be having a difficult time because you live in a world that hasn't given you any information. It doesn't give you very much support. So here's one of the reasons I want you to see that grief has become more difficult. We are in the midst in our country of a rural to urban transition. Our country is becoming more and more urban. That may be a little bit more difficult for you to see here in Los Alamos, but it's something that's happened. So I want you to think about it. Just think about if you lived in a little house on the prairie out there with Charles Ingalls and Half Pint and the rest of the crew. If somebody got sick, what would happen? Well, the doctor would come out there. The doc would come out, and he'd ride in his buggy, and he'd come out to the house, and he'd take care of Grandma when she was sick, and he may have known her, might have known since she was a child. He might have helped give birth to her, and he knew everything about Grandma. And he would take care of her, and he would come every day if he needed to see her. The whole family would be around Grandma. The kids would be helping Grandma through her illness. And everyone would be a part. The whole family would be a part of what's taking place with Grandma. And if you lived down a little house on the prairie, you saw the life cycle that would take place. You would see plants that would be planted, and they would grow, and then they would die. You'd see animals born, and then you'd see animals die. You would see the life cycle happening before you all the time. You'd be a part of taking care of Grandma. And whenever Grandma died, the doc would come out, and he would see to her and take care of her. And all the family would be standing around the room whenever Grandma died. And you know what Charles Ingalls would be doing? He'd be out in the barn making the casket for Grandma. And then they would put Grandma in the casket, and they would put her in the parlor, in the house, and everyone in the community would come to your house to view Grandma's body. And then they would have the service at the church. And at the church, you know what's right next door to the church? Is the cemetery. And every Sunday when you would go to church, you would come to the church and you would visit Grandma's grave. You would see death and dying happening in your life. Now, Charles Ingalls couldn't make it out on a little house on the prairie, so he had to move into town. And when he moved into town, they had this place called the funeral parlor. Now, what do you think they called it the funeral parlor? Because they used to have the casket in the parlor. And so now, whenever someone would die, they would take them to the cemetery that's right out on the edge of town, and they would bury them there. Now, today, when someone dies, we take them to the funeral home. Now, have you ever thought about why we call it the funeral home? You know, you go into the funeral home, and there's these little rooms that look like living rooms, and they have a couch, and they have coffee tables, and they're trying to make it look like a home, because it used to happen in the home, and now we have funeral homes, and we get further and further away from the death and dying process, and we get further and further away from people grieving and grieving the loss of someone you love as being a normal part of your life. Now, how is it when you go to the doctor today? Does the doctor come out to your house today? Or do you go to the doctor and you sit in this large room and you wait for your name to be called? And you feel kind of special when they call your name. You kind of go, yeah, I'm getting to go in, and y'all have to still wait. And you get to go in, you go into the little room, and they have lots of little rooms. And the doctor comes into the little rooms, and as he comes into the little rooms, he's skilled at not spending much time with you. And he goes to one little room after the other little room, and you become disconnected. I'm not saying that that's wrong. I'm just saying that that's different. I'm just saying that our country has made a shift to where we separate ourselves from death and dying. Just think about the words that we use whenever somebody's grieving. If somebody's grieving, they say, I don't want to start talking about it, because if I start talking about it, I'm going to break down. But you know what? If you're crying when you're grieving, you're not breaking down. You're breaking open. I don't want to start talking about it, because if I start talking about it, I'll lose it. You're not losing it when you cry because you love somebody. You're gaining it. You're getting connected to the love you have for somebody. You're not losing it. And just think about it. Do we have any positive words whenever somebody is actively grieving? Whenever they're actively crying? We don't have positive words for that. And here's what people do. They'll hand that person a Kleenex, right? And you hand that person a Kleenex, and what's the message when you hand them a Kleenex? We want you to stop. So let me tell you, if you want to help a grieving person, don't hand them the Kleenex whenever they're crying like that. Wait for the snot. And when you see snot, then give them the Kleenex. But they're crying. They need to cry. You're the tears you have when you're crying have a different chemical makeup than tears you have whenever you've injured yourself. Your body is releasing toxins when you're grieving. And your body is releasing itself of the stress. It's not a sign of weakness to cry. Oftentimes people say, I need to be strong for my family. And what does that mean to be strong? When we say we want to be strong for the family, what are we really saying? We're saying don't cry. And then the people around you won't want you to cry, right? And then people around you will, oftentimes, people's best friends or the closest people in their family, stay away from them. Because you're experiencing what their greatest nightmare is. And so they often will stay away from you. And then they'll say the craziest things to you. They'll say, well, it's been about 3 months since he died. Don't you think it's about time you moved on? Well, you got 2 other children. Why don't you focus on them? You know, even in the story of Job that's in the Bible, when we tell the story of Job, you know, his children die, and then later on he gets more children back, and like the end of the story is everything worked out for Job. Like Job never wept over those children who died in the beginning because he got a bunch more. We have the idea that people shouldn't be grieving, especially when there's a death of a child. People will say, well, I guess God just needed another angel. Like God's going around killing kids to get angels. You ever thought about that? I heard one lady say when her husband, who's a great pianist, and after he died, they said, I guess God needed another pianist up in heaven. And she said, like, Beethoven wasn't good enough. They had to take my husband to get another pianist. You see things that we say that don't make very much sense. And so we go through the grieving process and we don't know how to handle it and we don't know what to do. And so what we do is we begin to just do the best that we can. And we begin to not talk about it. And here's what I want you to see. In the midst of your darkest day, no matter how bad it may seem for you, there is light. Because what's happening to you is something that's very powerful, it's very spiritual, and it's incredibly human. Here's what I want you to see. In the midst of your darkness, and you need to find the light, there's 4 awakenings you need to wake up to. First of all, you need to wake up, be awakened to the humanity of your experience. What you're feeling is what everybody would feel. You may feel anger at the medical community, anger at insurance companies. You may even be angry with God. And you know, only people who have faith can be angry with God. You know, I've been angry at God. You know, people, like when you're going through a hard time, they'll quote you Romans 8:28, all things work together for good. You know, that's not something good to share with somebody who's in the midst of the grief. I remember after my dad died, I wrote a letter to God, and I said, Dear God, this is Danny. Don't give me any of that Romans 8:28 stuff. This is not good. This is not good that's happening to me. You need to do something. I'm on your team. And look what's going on with me. And so Janet came in and found the letter on the table. And she said, you know, I think we better get rid of this before the kids see it. Get rid of this letter. I like what the old Quaker said. He said, God, it's no wonder you got so few friends the way you treat the ones you got. You ever felt like that? So you can be angry, and it's human. You need to be awakened to the power of your humanity. Anger is your attempt to try to take back your authority in your life. You may be feeling sad, and sad's not a good enough word. I mean, sad is watching Little House on the Prairie. That's sad. Depressed is a clinical thing where, you know, the chemicals in your brain are not firing off right. Grief is different. It's different than depression. It's different than sad. And if you've never experienced it, then when you do, you will know it's not sad, it's not depression, it's grief. And you're incredibly human,
And it will challenge you physically. It'll challenge you emotionally. It'll challenge your worldview. It will cause you to question your mortality. You'll begin to think that one of these days I'm going to die. I mean, after my parents died, it was very hard for me because I realized I'm the next person in my family of origin to die. So you need to be awakened to the power of your humanity and feeling your feelings. Just let yourself be. There's nothing wrong with you. You're not going crazy. You're grieving. You need to be awakened to what matters most. You can be awakened to what matters most in grief. You begin to prioritize things. After my dad died, I sold the lawnmower. I sold the weed eater. I sold all my lawn equipment because I realized when I die, they're not going to stand up at my funeral and say, well, he mowed the grass every Saturday. And so I decided no matter what happens in my life, I'm not spending another Saturday mowing the lawn. I don't know how many Saturdays I got left. You begin to prioritize your life. You begin to focus in on what matters most. And Ira Byock wrote a book about the 4 things that matter most. And here's what he said. The 4 things that matter most are this. You need to tell the people you love that you love them while you have the chance. You need to tell the people who've been meaningful in your life, thank you, while you still have the chance. One Thanksgiving, I took 25 thank you cards and I wrote out thank yous to all my friends and people who've been meaningful to me in my life. And not just a thank you, just a paragraph of what they mean to me. To let them know. I didn't want it to go by without me saying thank you to them. You need to forgive the people you need to forgive. And most of us have people in our lives we need to forgive. Have you ever had that person that stabbed you in the back? Maybe stabbed you in the back and twisted the knife? We can carry that person around with us. Oftentimes we take them out and beat them up and put them back in our heart. We need to forgive people. And we need to ask people forgiveness if we've hurt them in any kind of way. So, tell the people you love them. Say thank you to the people who have been meaningful in your life. Forgive people who have hurt you. And ask for forgiveness if you need to ask someone for forgiveness. So that's power. You need to wake up to be awakened to the healing that's taking place in your life. There's healing that's going on in your life right this very minute. And oftentimes we don't see the healing because we're grieving, we're sad, we have tears, but that's a part of the healing process. I want you to think about this. If someone had burns over a large part of their body and they took them into the hospital to be taken care of, they would be in excruciating pain for weeks, perhaps months, before it began to get better. But they began to heal the moment they came into the hospital. You began to heal the first day after your loved one died. Oftentimes people are waiting to find acceptance. I'm going to get to a place where I can find acceptance. Acceptance meant, for a lot of people, they think it means that they agree with it. Acceptance doesn't mean you agree with what's going on. Acceptance means that you're just learning how to adjust your life to be different now. If you've lost your parents, oftentimes it feels like you've lost your past. If you've lost your spouse, you feel like you've lost your present. And if you've lost a child, you feel like you've lost your future. And you have to begin to make adjustments. But you can see that you need to see you're in the midst of a healing process. Acceptance isn't a place to get to. Acceptance has been pulling you along all along the way. Acceptance happened when you planned a funeral. Some level of acceptance happened then. Acceptance is when you began to make adjustments in the way that you live and the way you organize your life. Acceptance is pulling you along, allowing you to have moments where you experience your grief. You may have grief attacks. You'll be driving down the road and you'll smell a smell, or you'll hear a song, or you'll see something, and it will cause you to once again experience the grief, and the tears begin to flow. You need to be awakened to the power of love. Let me share something to you that's really spiritual. It's a little, a little philosophical. And some people may think it's a little hippie voodoo stuff, but I figure you guys in Los Alamos can handle that. So I want you to think about this. We are who we are in our spirit. Like when you look at me right now, you're seeing a 64-year-old white male with gray hair, space between his teeth, a fine specimen of humanity. That's what you see when you look at me. But who I am is who I am in my spirit. That's who I really am. And in my spirit, I still feel like I'm 18 years old inside. And so that's the eternal part of us. And you know what? When our spirit leaves our bodies, everyone knows it's not there. If you've ever been with somebody when they pass away, if you've ever been with them, you know that when their spirit leaves their body, they're no longer there. It's an incredible realization in that moment that their spirit leaves their body. And so what they do is their spirit is released. Their spirit, up until the time they die, is trapped in this body that's trapped in time. Because we're experiencing time one moment at a time. That's how we experience. But now that they are not trapped in their body, they are in eternity. They are in infinity. And you know what? Their love that they have for you is no longer trapped in time. The love they have for you is infinite. And it's eternal. Now catch this. You are who you are in your spirit. But you're still stuck in time. But here's what I think happens. Our spirit that's stuck in time connects with their spirit that is in infinity. And the love we have for them is so powerful and so large and expands so much, our bodies can't hardly contain it. If you love them on a scale of 1 to 10, and you say, sure, I love them to a 10. After somebody dies, you love them to 1,000. And that's because they've gone into eternity and infinity. And your body is connecting with that. And so you are experiencing the power of love. If I could wave a magic wand, we wouldn't even call it grief. If I could wave a magic wand, I'd say we're having a love reaction. And when you start having those tears, you just say, I'm loving my husband today. I'm loving my mom. I'm loving my son or my daughter. I'm just experiencing the love. Pardon me while I have these tears, and I just experience my love for a moment. Awaken to the power of love. But then we need to awaken to the unlimited possibilities. We live in a world that has unlimited possibilities. Sarah's in the midst of her vision of creating a hospice house that will be a place where people can go and find compassionate, understanding care at the end of their life. She has a vision for nurses to be there with the family. Much like Little House on the Prairie, the doctor came to you. Much like the family being around you on Little House on the Prairie. You have support that will be there. Social workers, chaplain, spiritual needs that will be met for you. Bereavement support, grief support. She has vision for that. I want you to see this. There's unlimited possibilities. She's halfway to raising the funds, but let me tell you something. We live in a world full of abundance. God does not have a shortage. The American economy might, but God's economy is full of abundance. There is enough money to fulfill the vision that would put Los Alamos on the map in the world when it comes to end-of-life issues. Unlimited possibility. And let me say for you who are here who are grieving, and maybe you've lost loved ones, there's unlimited possibilities for you. You don't know what the future has for you. There are great things ahead for you that you can't even know. I told you that when I was in college, I was working as a court clerk. And one day this guy came to work there. He was older than me. He'd been to Vietnam before he went to college. And so we became very good friends.
And we would go play basketball together. We'd play tennis together. We'd go out to eat together. We were going to the same college together. We even took a couple of classes together. Very good friends. Then one day we were going to be playing basketball, and I was changing shoes, and he noticed the scars on my foot and on my leg. And he said, "How did you get that?" And remember, I never talked to anybody about my polio. I didn't talk to people about my brother. I said, "Well, I had polio when I was a child, and I had an operation that changed my life. And there's like over 100 stitches in my right foot." And so he said, "Wow, I didn't know that about you." So that night when he came to work, he brought a picture. He said, "I have this picture of my first grade class. And my best friend when I was in the first grade died from polio." And he pointed to the picture of my brother. How powerful. And then he would be in our wedding. And I'm still connected to him today on Facebook. Now see, I couldn't have thought that up. Unlimited possibilities. You're going through your life, and it looks like if you're grieving, it's all come to an end. It'll never be good again. But let me tell you something. If you can't believe it's going to be good again, if you could just have faith in my faith, that I have faith, it's going to be good for you again. There's unlimited possibilities ahead. You have to awaken to the possibility. But you just got to take one day at a time as it gets revealed to you. There's a poem that says, "I walked a mile with pleasure, she chattered all the way, but I was none the wiser for all she had to say. But then I walked with sorrow, and never a word said she. But oh, the things I learned when sorrow walked with me." If I had my choice, I would rather walk with pleasure than sorrow any day. I wish I hadn't had polio. I wish my brother hadn't died. I wish my family would have been different than the way it was when I was growing up as a kid. But you know what? Even in the midst of all my darkness, there has been light. And in the midst of all that, I've come to a place in my life where I engage life better, I understand people better, I understand my family better, I have understood God in a deeper way than I ever have before, and I have been able to connect to the power of love that radiates through my life and radiates through your life, and is certainly in this room with all the love we have for everybody, and then you have all the love that God has for each of us. We live in a world full of love, and when we grieve, we're connecting to that love. And I want to encourage you today. You're going to make it. I want to encourage you in your community. Give support to the people who grieve. Give them understanding. And support your hospice community that is here to help people have the best end-of-life experience they have. Listen, hospice is not just about people dying. Hospice is about people living the best life until they die. And I encourage you to help Sarah as she goes about carrying forth her great vision for this community. I really appreciate you guys letting me come and talk to you today. I hope you were encouraged. Thank you very much.